The church pews were lined with polished oak, the scent of lilies thick in the air, mingling with candle wax and quiet grief. Mourners shuffled in slowly, dressed in black, whispering soft condolences as they passed the front aisle where the closed mahogany casket lay under a spray of white roses. The man inside, Marcus Langley, had been, to most, a symbol of success. A real estate mogul, philanthropist, father, husband. Now, just another obituary headline with a too-short lifespan. At the front of the church stood Teresa Langley, 53, his widow. Regal even in mourning, she wore a modest black dress that fit her with the elegance of a woman who had spent her life hosting galas and giving speeches for charity. Her dark hair, streaked with silver, was pinned in a perfect chignon. Her eyes were unreadable behind large black sunglasses, but her jaw was tight, too tight for someone who was merely grieving. She wasn't crying. People assumed it was because she was strong. That's how they saw Teresa, unwavering, composed, the kind of woman who could hold a family together even after it fractured. But the truth was simpler and colder. Teresa wasn't crying because she had already cried. She had done her mourning long before Marcus's heart finally gave out. She had cried for the first time years ago, in the kitchen, when she found a receipt for a diamond bracelet he never gave her. She had cried the second time when she overheard his late-night phone calls. And the third, when she opened his office drawer and found hotel keys. Now, there were no more tears left. Her son stood beside her, stiff in his suit, eyes darting nervously at the crowd. Friends, clients, family, old investors. Teresa knew them all. She had hosted their wives, sent them thank you cards, raised money for their causes. She nodded at each face out of habit, until her eyes briefly caught a woman sitting in the last row. Slim, red-haired, wearing a simple black coat, eyes red but sharp. She sat alone. Teresa blinked slowly, then turned her gaze forward again. She didn't react. She didn't need to. She knew who the woman was. The service began. A young minister spoke with practiced solemnity, reading from Psalms and offering platitudes about life's fleeting beauty. The organist played softly, almost reverently, while guests bowed their heads. But in the back, the woman in the black coat didn't close her eyes. Rachel Monroe watched everything with a quiet, electric rage. Her fingers curled against the fabric of her lap, fists clenched beneath the hem of her coat. The invitation hadn't been sent to her, but she came anyway. No one stopped her. No one even knew her name. To everyone else in this church, she was just another mourner. A friend of the family, perhaps. A former client. Maybe a distant relative from out of town. But she wasn't here to mourn. Her heart thudded against her chest, each beat echoing louder than the minister's voice. In her purse was a letter, typed but unsigned, from Marcus. Dated 6 months ago. It read like a promise. I'm leaving her soon. I just need time. We'll finally be free. I swear. He had told her that in person too. Whispered it in bed. Swore it over wine. But he died, and the promises died with him. There was no freedom, no future, no inheritance, no mention of her name anywhere in the obituary, the will, the eulogy. Not even a single flower delivered to her address. She was a ghost to this man's life. And ghosts, she had decided, didn't cry. They haunted. The organ stopped. Teresa stepped forward. Slowly, gracefully, she rested her gloved hand on the casket, whispering something too low to hear. Some guests cried quietly behind her. A woman in the second row sobbed into her husband's shoulder. Rachel stood. No one noticed her yet. Not really. She reached into the pocket of her coat, her eyes locked on Teresa's back. Her pulse quickened. Her fingers found the cold steel. She closed them around it. For a split second, she thought of turning around, leaving, letting the silence have the final word. But then she remembered the look in Marcus's eyes that last time, when he smiled at her and said soon. That single eye had unraveled everything. Rachel took one step forward, then another. The funeral was about to end. But for Teresa Langley, something much worse was just beginning. Rachel Monroe never intended to fall in love with a married man. She had standards, or at least she used to. At 39, she was independent, smart, and tired of games. She'd been through her share of heartbreaks. Artists who drank too much, executives who lied too well, one who ghosted her after 6 months like she was a bad dream. So when she first met Marcus Langley, she didn't expect anything more than a paycheck. He had hired her to redesign the foyer and master bedroom of his vacation property in Napa. He liked modern, minimal lines. She preferred rustic elegance. They debated over color palettes during their first consultation, and he smiled in a way that made her stomach knot. Not lust, recognition, like he already knew her. He was charming in that quiet, calculated way. The kind of man who made you feel like the only person in the room without ever raising his voice. And he knew how to talk, not just about business or design, but about books, psychology, politics. Rachel found herself lingering after meetings, sipping wine with him while discussing art installations and hotel renovations. He listened to her like she mattered. That was new. He never mentioned a wife, not at first. When he did, it was casual. "My marriage has been over for years," he said one evening, swirling his scotch. "We stay together for appearances. Charity boards. She has her life. I have mine." Rachel knew the type. She should have walked away, but she didn't, because Marcus made her feel seen, desired, important, and for a while it felt real. They started meeting in San Francisco. Discreet dinners. Weekend trips where no one asked questions. He bought her things. Not gaudy jewelry, but thoughtful gifts. A rare first edition, a handmade sketchbook, a pendant from Paris. Once, he took her to a vineyard and said, "I want to build something here. For us." He told her he was changing his will, that he bought a condo in her name, that she was the only woman who ever really understood him. Rachel believed him. When she found out she was pregnant, she was terrified and hopeful. Maybe this would finally make Marcus commit. Maybe they could be a real family. But when she told him, his reaction was cold, almost clinical. "Are you sure it's mine?" he asked. That question changed everything. She miscarried 3 weeks later, alone in her apartment, bleeding in silence. Marcus sent flowers. After that, the distance started to grow. Calls unanswered. Texts left on read. He said he was busy, traveling, tied up with legal matters. But Rachel knew the pattern. He was fading. Still, she held on to hope. He had promised. He had whispered forever into her hair, held her hand under candlelight. She wasn't just a fling. She was the plan. 6 months before he died, he sent her a letter. Typed. No signature. "It's happening soon. I just need a little more time. I promise you're not forgotten." She kept that letter folded in her wallet like scripture. Then came news. Marcus Langley, dead at 59 from a sudden heart attack. A private memorial would be held by his wife. No mention of Rachel. No call. No closure. Just a name on the news ticker and a black and white photo from their wedding 25 years ago. Rachel stared at the screen, her hand trembling. The man who had occupied 3 years of her life was gone, and no one even knew she existed. The next day, she called his office. No one returned her message. She called the attorney he had mentioned in passing, someone named Fletcher. The man was polite but curt. "I'm sorry, Ms. Monroe. There's no record of you in Mr. Langley's estate files." No, that can't be right," she stammered. "He told me. He promised." "I'm sorry," the man repeated. That night, Rachel sat on her bed in silence, letter in hand, wine glass untouched. Something inside her broke, not from heartbreak, but from humiliation. She had believed him, trusted him, and now he was gone, and she was nothing but a footnote that would never be written. For days, she stayed inside, curtains drawn, TV muted. She rehearsed conversations in her head. Teresa, the will, the baby. She imagined different outcomes. What if she had told the press? What if she had exposed the affair? But nothing gave her peace. Then she saw the obituary again. This time, with a note about the public memorial at St. Andrew's Church. It would be open to all. A celebration of Marcus's legacy of integrity and leadership. She laughed out loud. Legacy? That was when she made her decision. Rachel didn't want revenge. Not at first. She just wanted to be seen. Acknowledge her pain. Remind the world, and Teresa, that Marcus Langley hadn't been a saint. But somewhere between grief and rage, she remembered the .38 caliber pistol in the back of her closet. left over from a camping trip with her ex. She had never fired it, but the weight felt familiar when she picked it up. She packed it in her coat pocket, just in case, because sometimes the only way to make people listen is to make them bleed. Teresa Langley had always known how to play her part. From the outside, she had it all. A husband who commanded boardrooms, a sprawling estate in Pacific Heights, a diamond ring large enough to start conversations. She graced charity galas in custom gowns, spoke at women's leadership summits, and had her picture printed in San Francisco Society pages more times than she cared to count. She was the kind of woman others whispered about, but always with admiration. Elegant, poised, unshakable. What they didn't know, what they could never guess, was how much of that was performance. Her marriage to Marcus started like most fairy tales do. Passion, ambition, shared dreams. They built an empire together, or so it seemed. But as the years wore on, cracks formed behind the curtain. She had suspected the first affair a decade ago, after finding a lacy black bra that wasn't hers buried under the passenger seat of his Jaguar. Marcus laughed when she confronted him. "You really think I'd be that stupid?" he said, smooth as ever. "Someone probably planted it. You know how people like to stir up gossip." Teresa didn't argue. She didn't scream. She simply poured herself a drink and filed the moment away. Over the years, the evidence piled up: late-night meetings, secretive phone calls, a sudden interest in cologne he had never worn before. Marcus was discreet, but not perfect, and Teresa was smart enough to know that men like him didn't stay faithful, not when they had power and options. She could have left. She had the money. She had the name. But divorce meant scandal, headlines, and losing control of the narrative. Teresa had spent a lifetime crafting her reputation, and she wasn't about to throw it away because her husband had a wandering eye. So she made a decision. She would stay, but on her terms. Their marriage became an arrangement. He had his world, and she had hers. They appeared together when necessary: fundraisers, funerals, photo ops. And in private, they lived like polite strangers in opposite wings of a grand house. Teresa poured herself into her charity work. She mentored young women, built housing programs, donated millions. If Marcus was going to tarnish their name behind closed doors, then she would polish it in public. But deep down, she still felt the sting, not just from betrayal, but for being erased. She saw in the way Marcus would light up talking about new ideas from someone at the office, the casual dismissal of her thoughts, the distant look when she tried to talk about anything beyond schedules or appearances. Over time, he stopped seeing her altogether, and she had accepted that. Until Rachel. She had seen the woman once, by accident. It was a Monday afternoon. Marcus said he was flying to Los Angeles for a client lunch. Teresa had a board meeting cancel last minute and decided to stop by his office to surprise him. She brought lunch from his favorite Thai place. When the elevator doors opened, she saw them through the glass. Marcus and a red-headed woman in a black pencil skirt. They stood close, too close. He was laughing, his hand brushing her back as she handed him something. Teresa didn't step forward. She didn't barge in or throw the food in his face. She simply turned around, walked back to her car, and sat in silence with the lunch on her lap until it went cold. She didn't confront him that night, or any night, but she never forgot the woman's face. Months later, she found hotel receipts, a love note signed only with the letter R. That same red lipstick on a white collar Marcus swore he hadn't worn. Still, she said nothing. Teresa wasn't naive. She had long accepted that her marriage was transactional. But what haunted her wasn't the affair. It was the thought that this one might be different. That maybe, just maybe, Marcus had fallen in love. That terrified her more than anything. And now, at his funeral, she stood alone at his casket, surrounded by friends, press, cameras, and secrets. She wondered if anyone else knew. If Rachel had ever called the house. If the staff had seen them together. If Marcus had told Rachel he loved her the way he used to say it to Teresa, back when they were still young, still believing. She touched the edge of the casket, her fingers trembling slightly. So many things she wanted to say, but none came out. Not "I forgive you." Not "I hate you." Just silence. And she felt it, that sensation of being watched. She turned her head slightly, eyes scanning the back pews. The red-haired woman was still there, hands folded neatly, staring. Rachel. So she had the nerve to come. Teresa held her gaze for a second, cold and deliberate. No surprise, no panic, just acknowledgement. I know who you are, Teresa thought silently. And I know what you cost me. She turned back to the casket. The organ began to play again. But deep inside her chest, a knot was forming, a premonition that this funeral wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Teresa stood frozen for a moment longer, her eyes locked on the casket. In her silence, she replayed the last few weeks before Marcus died. His complexion had turned sallow. His hands trembled when he poured his whiskey. He complained of dizziness but refused to see a doctor. He claimed it was stress, but she had lived beside that man for 23 years. She could spot a lie by the twitch in his left eye, and his eye had been twitching all month. Then there was the bottle, that small amber vial with no label, hidden beneath socks in his drawer. It smelled faintly bitter, something she recognized from the greenhouse. Foxglove, digitalis. For years, she had trimmed those leaves in her garden, always wearing gloves, always washing her hands afterward. She remembered once reading that a single mistake in dosage could stop a heart in seconds. And Marcus? Marcus didn't understand the difference between a sedative and a time bomb. He thought he was untouchable. She tilted her head slightly, watching the flicker of candlelight against the polished mahogany lid. She didn't cry. She didn't whisper goodbye. She didn't even pray. She simply thought, let the world think his heart gave out. Let the world remember him as powerful. Let the truth stay where it belongs, buried like the man himself. And with that, Teresa turned, lifted her chin, and walked away from the casket as if she had buried something far more dangerous than a man. The organ's final note faded into silence, leaving only the sound of shifting heels and muffled sniffles inside the chapel. The minister cleared his throat and offered a gentle invitation. If anyone would like to say a few final words, now is the time. Teresa Langley stepped forward. The murmur in the pews quieted as the widow approached the casket. Even in her grief, there was a stately grace to her every move, a kind of unshakable dignity that came from years of surviving behind a carefully curated facade. She rested one gloved hand on the polished wood. She didn't speak loudly, just a soft whisper meant for no one else but the man inside. I should have left you 100 times, she breathed, but I stayed, and maybe that's what I'll regret the most. Behind her, Rachel Monroe rose from her seat in the back. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. Not in the eyes of the world. Not in the obituary. Not in the will. She had no seat at this funeral, no name on the program, no condolence card waiting at home. The only thing she had was the hollow weight in her chest and the loaded .38 pistol tucked inside her coat. The room blurred as she moved forward. Every step felt like walking through molasses, dreamlike but deliberate. Her hand clenched tightly inside her pocket, wrapped around the handle of the weapon. Her mind raced. She erased me. He erased me. And now she gets to play the victim? Rachel had replayed this moment for days. Imagined every angle. How people would scream. How someone might try to tackle her. How fast she'd have to pull the trigger. But nothing prepared her for how quiet the moment would actually feel. As Teresa stepped away from the casket and turned back toward the pews, their eyes locked. Teresa froze. For the briefest instant, Rachel saw something flicker in her expression. Not fear. Not even shock. Recognition. She knows, Rachel realized. And then everything moved fast. Rachel pulled the gun from her coat and raised it, leveling it straight at the woman who, in her mind, had stolen everything. Her promises, her future, her place in the world. Gasps erupted. People screamed. Someone yelled, "Gun!" But Rachel was already pulling the trigger. Bang! The sound cracked through the chapel like a thunderclap. Teresa staggered backward, a blossom of red spreading across the front of her black dress. She didn't fall immediately. She looked down, confused, as if trying to process what had just happened. Then her knees buckled. She collapsed beside the casket. Panic exploded. People screamed, ducked behind pews, ran for the doors. A man lunged at Rachel, but she turned the gun on him, her hands trembling. "I loved him," she shouted, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He said he was leaving you. He promised me everything." Security from the church burst in from the vestibule, shouting commands. "Drop the weapon. Hands where we can see them." Rachel hesitated, her breath ragged, the gun still in her hands. For a second, she looked like she might pull the trigger again, on herself or someone else. But then her shoulders dropped. She let the gun fall to the floor. They swarmed her, wrestled her to the ground, cuffed her hands behind her back. Her knees scraped against the marble floor as she sobbed, mascara streaking down her face. Teresa lay motionless, blood pooling beneath her. Her son knelt beside her, screaming for help. Paramedics were called, though everyone already knew this wasn't the kind of wound you walked away from. The church, once a sanctuary of grief, had become a crime scene. Outside, reporters scrambled for statements. Cameras arrived before the ambulance. By the time Rachel was escorted to the squad car, the headlines were already being written. Funeral shooting rocks San Francisco. Widow shot by husband's mistress. Socialite Teresa Langley gunned down at late husband's memorial. Love triangle turns deadly in shocking public killing. Rachel sat in the back of the police cruiser, handcuffed and silent. Her mind was blank, not regretful, not angry, just empty. Inside the chapel, officers strung yellow crime scene tape between pews while mourners gathered outside in clusters, trying to understand how something so surreal had just happened in front of their eyes. One of the detectives found Teresa's glove on the ground, still smeared with blood, resting near the foot of the casket. Beside it on the floor was something no one expected, a folded letter. The detective opened it carefully. A short note, written in clean, cursive handwriting. "You died a long time ago to me. I only stayed to preserve the image. Goodbye, Marcus. T." Even in death, Teresa had her secrets. The sirens were still echoing down the boulevard when they zipped Teresa Langley into a body bag. Outside the church, a stunned crowd lingered under gray skies, whispering, filming, speculating. Red and blue lights reflected off the polished hoods of luxury cars parked outside St. Andrews. What was supposed to be a dignified farewell had collapsed into chaos, a high society tragedy soaked in blood. Teresa had been pronounced dead at the scene. One bullet, upper chest, close range, clean, devastating. Rachel Monroe sat in the back of the squad car, hands cuffed behind her, mascara still streaking her cheeks. Her jaw clenched so tightly she thought her molars might crack. She didn't speak. She didn't scream anymore. She just stared out the window, watching reporters and bystanders hold up phones and microphones, their faces pressed close to the glass like she was some animal in a traveling cage. In that moment, she wasn't a woman betrayed. She was a killer. Inside the chapel, yellow tape hung limply between the pews. Officers cataloged blood spatters, collected shell casings, and took statements from still shaking witnesses. The minister, pale and trembling, sat in a back room with a blanket around his shoulders. Detective Linda Alvarez, the lead investigator, surveyed the scene with a calm precision honed over 20 years on the job. She was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, the kind of detective who never reacted until she had the whole picture. She crouched beside the blood-stained floor near the casket. A letter had been recovered near the body, written by Teresa herself. The tone was cold, detached, a farewell without mourning. She knew something, Alvarez muttered under her breath. Or someone. She stood, glancing at the officers logging evidence. "I want a full background on the suspect, Rachel Monroe. Start with known associations. And dig into Marcus Langley's estate records. I want to know what the hell this man was hiding." By that evening, the story had gone national. News outlets raced to outdo each other. Socialite widow shot dead at husband's funeral by secret mistress. Love triangle turns fatal in San Francisco church shooting. A gunshot, a body, a secret life exposed. On social media, hashtags trended globally. Hashtag funeral killer. Hashtag Langley affair. Hashtag murder at the altar. Everyone had an opinion. Some said Rachel was mentally unstable. Others painted her as a woman driven to madness by betrayal. And a few, just a few, called her brave for confronting the lies of a powerful man. But what no one knew yet was just how deep Marcus Langley's lies ran. Detective Alvarez worked through the night. Rachel was processed and held without bail. Her phone was seized. So was her laptop. On both devices were hundreds of messages between her and Marcus. Texts, emails, voice notes. Promises, declarations of love. Mentions of leaving Teresa soon. Mentions of money. Mentions of a future. Some of it sounded sweet. Some of it sounded like manipulation. Buried in her email inbox was one sent to Marcus just 3 weeks before his death. Subject line: "You said you'd leave her. You lied." Marcus never replied. The next morning, Alvarez visited the Langley estate. It was everything the news made it out to be. Marble floors, glass staircases, soft classical music playing from a built-in sound system. But beneath the luxury was a stillness that felt eerie now. Cold, lifeless. Teresa's son, Julian, greeted her. He was in his late 20s, pale from shock but cooperative. "I always knew my dad had secrets," he said quietly. "I didn't know they'd get my mother killed." They sat in the office, Marcus's private space. Locked drawers, password-protected drives, a fireproof safe behind a painting. Julian handed over the keys. Inside were documents, old hotel receipts, a burner phone, multiple names and bank accounts tied to shell corporations, and a stack of letters written in Marcus's handwriting, most of them to women, not all of them Rachel. The last one was dated 2 weeks before his death. It was addressed to someone named A.M. "Looks like Rachel wasn't the only one," Alvarez muttered. Julian ran his hand over his face. "I think my mom knew about the affairs. Maybe not all of them, but she wasn't blind. She left a letter," Alvarez said. "She said she stayed for the image." Julian nodded. "That sounds like her." Back at the station, Rachel was in a cell, silent. When Alvarez finally sat across from her, tape recorder running, Rachel didn't deny what she'd done. "I didn't go there to kill her," she said quietly. I wanted to be acknowledged. He promised me so much. He told me I was his future. Then he died and I became nothing." Alvarez studied her. "You were never mentioned in his will." Rachel laughed bitterly. "Of course not. Marcus Langley loved lies more than he ever loved anyone." A pause. "But I loved him," she added. "I just didn't know I was disposable." And so, in the course of a single day, Marcus Langley, the man buried with 1,000 accolades, was revealed not as a tragic loss, but as a master manipulator whose double life had sparked a killing. Teresa was mourned again, this time not as a widow, but as a woman who held it together while living with a truth that finally bled into daylight. And Rachel Monroe? She became the face of heartbreak, turned violent. But the story wasn't over yet. Detective Alvarez knew there were more names, more letters, and maybe one more secret left to dig up. Detective Linda Alvarez had learned one hard truth in her 2 decades with the SFPD. The dead lie more often than the living. And Marcus Langley? He was practically fluent in deception. 2 weeks after the shooting, Alvarez sat in her office with files spread across the desk like a war map. Estate records, forensic reports, witness interviews, and digital evidence pulled from Marcus's devices. At first glance, the case seemed open and shut. Jilted mistress, public murder, wealthy patriarch's double life. But something about it didn't sit right. Marcus hadn't just cheated. He had built an entire architecture of deceit. Alvarez flipped through the contents of a red folder labeled Langley, Financial Holdings. Inside were transactions spanning 5 years. Offshore accounts, transfers between dummy corporations, and large sums routed to women using only first names. A.M. None of these were his wife. None of them matched Rachel's full name, either. When Alvarez cross-referenced the phone records and emails, a web of romantic entanglements emerged. 5 women, all younger, all financially entangled with him, all fed the same fantasy. "I'm leaving her soon. You're my future." Rachel had just been the one to snap. One lead stood out. A woman listed in an encrypted messaging app simply as A.M. She had received several large wire transfers from Langley Shell Company, including one marked as a prenatal medical expense. Alvarez's instincts flared. She located Alexandra Myers, a 31-year-old Pilates instructor living in San Diego. The name matched. The bank records matched. But when Alvarez visited her, the conversation took a sharp turn. "I don't want to talk about Marcus," Alexandra said, standing in her doorway, arms crossed, baby monitor clipped to her hip. "He's dead, and honestly good. You have a child with him?" Alvarez asked gently. Alexandra didn't answer immediately, but her eyes shifted toward the monitor. A tiny whimper crackled through the speaker. "Yes," she finally whispered, "and I wish I didn't." Over the next 2 hours, Alexandra painted the picture Alvarez had feared. She had met Marcus during a private fitness retreat he sponsored. He was charming, generous, attentive. He offered to help her open her own studio, even promised to support her if she ever had kids. When she got pregnant, he insisted on keeping it quiet, said his wife wasn't ready to find out. Then he stopped returning her calls. She had never told anyone who the father was, not even her family. "He made me feel like a home," Alexandra said, voice shaking. Then he vanished like I was a mistake. Alvarez left with a DNA swab, a signed statement, and a gnawing sense that Rachel wasn't the only woman Marcus had broken. Meanwhile, back at the department, lab results came in from Marcus's safe, the one found behind the painting in his office. Hidden inside were old photographs, hotel receipts, 2 burner phones, and handwritten letters. One of the phones was a goldmine. Encrypted text threads revealed even more women: a graduate student in Portland, a waitress in Miami, and an art dealer in New York. All of them had believed they were the one. All of them had been told the same lie. One message stood out: "Can't talk now. Wife's getting suspicious. But don't worry, soon she'll be out of the picture. You and I can finally start fresh." It was dated 6 months before his death. Alvarez leaned back in her chair, brows furrowing. Was it just a metaphor? A manipulation tactic? Or had Marcus planned to get rid of Teresa? She re-examined the autopsy report. Official cause of death: heart attack. Natural causes. But the file also noted high levels of digitalis in his bloodstream, typically used to treat heart conditions, but toxic in elevated doses. He had been taking prescribed meds. But what if someone had tampered with them? Alvarez ordered a full toxicology reanalysis, just in case. Meanwhile, Rachel's legal team shifted strategy. At first, they planned to plead guilty and push for leniency based on emotional trauma. But as new women came forward and Marcus's lies unraveled, Rachel's attorney proposed a new angle: temporary insanity brought on by prolonged manipulation and psychological abuse. She was emotionally exploited by a man with a long history of deception, her lawyer said in a press conference. And while her actions were inexcusable, they were not unprovoked. Public opinion began to fracture. Some saw Rachel as a cold-blooded killer. Others began to call her a tragic figure, the latest in a long line of women discarded by a man who wore charm like armor. News programs ran segments titled "The Other Victims of Marcus Langley" and "When Power Seduces and Destroys." Teresa's funeral, the second one, was held quietly, without cameras. Her son, Julian, refused interviews. He had moved back to their estate and fired nearly every employee in the household. But one afternoon, he called Alvarez. "There's something I think you should see," he said. In the attic, tucked away in an old jewelry box, was a flash drive. Julian didn't know it was there until he began boxing up Teresa's belongings. It contained video recordings, secretly filmed from a camera in Marcus's home office. Alvarez watched in silence as Marcus appeared on screen, pacing with a glass of bourbon in one hand, phone pressed to his ear. "You know how this works?" he said into the phone. "I tell them what they want to hear. They believe it. And when they stop being useful, I cut them loose." Another video. He laughed as he read aloud a message from Rachel, mocking her desperation. Another. He told someone, "Teresa's more of a liability than a partner now. If she got hit by a bus, I'd probably be free by summer." Alvarez's stomach turned. The question was no longer whether Marcus had ruined lives. It was whether someone had helped him die. The courtroom was cold, not from the air conditioning, but from the sheer weight of what had brought everyone here. Rachel Monroe, now a pale, gaunt version of herself, sat at the defense table in a navy blazer 2 sizes too large. Her wrists were free, but the invisible chains of shame and notoriety bound her tighter than any cuffs. It had been 6 months since the day she pulled the trigger at Marcus Langley's funeral. And now, the world was watching her fall apart, one headline at a time. She was charged with first-degree murder for the killing of Teresa Langley, and prosecutors wanted to make an example of her. The motive, they argued, was simple: jealousy, rejection, humiliation. But as the trial unfolded, it became clear that nothing about this case was simple. The prosecution painted Rachel as an emotionally unstable woman who brought a loaded weapon into a house of worship and executed a grieving widow in cold blood. She didn't come to mourn, the district attorney said, pacing before the jury. She came to finish a story that Marcus Langley never had the courage to. Then came the defense. Rachel Monroe is not a killer in the way you imagine, her attorney, Elena Moore, began. She is a woman who was emotionally manipulated, financially exploited, and psychologically groomed by a man who made a career out of lying. The courtroom stirred. Jurors leaned forward. The gallery, filled with reporters, former business partners, and curious spectators, was silent. Detective Alvarez was called early. Calm, clinical, unflinching. She walked the jury through the timeline. Rachel's affair with Marcus, the messages, the erased promises, and the mounting psychological pressure that led to the moment at the funeral. Then she introduced the twist. The secret videos Teresa had saved, of Marcus mocking the women he seduced, even fantasizing about Teresa's death. One clip silenced the courtroom entirely. If Teresa dropped dead tomorrow, I'd be a free man. I'd host the funeral myself and serve champagne. The judge had to pause the trial for 5 minutes as gasps turned to murmurs and several jurors visibly recoiled. The defense team subtly changed their angle from self-pity to survival. Elena Moore argued that Marcus Langley wasn't just an adulterer. He was a predator, charismatic, powerful, and deliberate. He didn't love these women, she told the jury. He used them, over and over, until there was nothing left but wreckage. Just when the trial seemed to focus solely on Rachel's actions, Alvarez returned to the stand with a final bombshell: reopened toxicology results from Marcus Langley's autopsy. Initial cause of death: heart failure. Updated finding: digitoxin levels 3 times the therapeutic limit. Enough to kill. And it didn't match the dosage on his prescribed medication. The courtroom froze. Are you saying he was poisoned? The prosecutor demanded. Alvarez nodded. It's no longer being ruled out. For a moment, all eyes turned, not to Rachel, but to Julian Langley, seated behind the prosecution, his jaw clenched. He stood and walked out before reporters could descend. Rachel's attorney seized the opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, she addressed the jury, Rachel Monroe may have pulled the trigger, but if you believe Marcus Langley was the true architect of this tragedy, then ask yourselves, who really started the fire? And how far did the flames spread before the funeral even began? After 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty, but not of first-degree murder. Rachel was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, with the court recognizing mitigating psychological duress, prolonged emotional manipulation, and significant provocation by the victim's spouse. She was sentenced to 18 years in prison, eligible for parole after 10. Rachel didn't cry when the verdict was read. She simply nodded, quietly, numbly, like she'd already lived through a worse punishment, being forgotten by the man who had promised her everything. The news cycle spun for weeks. Talk shows debated whether Rachel was a monster or a martyr. The Langley estate was sued by 2 additional women with children claiming paternity. Multiple non-disclosure agreements were uncovered in Marcus's archives, all signed by women who had affairs with him, in exchange for silence and monthly payments. Teresa Langley's foundation launched a campaign in her name, Dignity Over Deception, aimed at supporting women caught in coercive relationships with powerful men. Julian Langley moved out of San Francisco and refused all interviews. Privately, he funded a scholarship in his mother's name for survivors of emotional abuse. As for Rachel, she was transferred to a medium-security facility upstate. No visitors, no interviews. But word spread among inmates that she kept a single folded letter under her pillow, the last message Marcus had sent her before he died. "We'll be together soon. I promise." Even in a cell, even in silence, the ghost of Marcus Langley never really left her. A year had passed since the funeral-turned-crime scene that stunned San Francisco high society. A year since Teresa Langley fell beside her husband's casket, a bullet ripping through her chest in the middle of a sacred ceremony. A year since the face of Rachel Monroe became a symbol of obsession, betrayal, and emotional ruin. But behind the headlines and hashtags, real lives had been permanently altered. Rachel adjusted the collar of her orange prison jumpsuit and stared at the patch of sun filtering through the high, narrow window of her cell. She kept mostly to herself now. No fights, no friends, just a quiet routine, books, kitchen duty, sleep, repeat. Every inmate had a story. Hers just happened to be on the news. There were whispers around the facility. "That's the woman who shot the widow at a funeral." Some looked at her with disgust, others with morbid fascination. But Rachel didn't respond. She stopped trying to explain herself months ago. The only thing she still clung to was the letter. Marcus's final message, folded and creased, corners worn from sleepless nights reading it under the thin glow of her cell light. She no longer believed the words, but somehow it comforted her to see them, like proof that he had, at one point, thought she mattered. She still had nightmares, not about the shooting, about Teresa's eyes, the way they had looked at her in that last second, calm, resigned, not angry, not afraid, as if Teresa had known this moment was inevitable. Rachel sometimes wished Teresa had screamed. Detective Alvarez stood by the window of her office, watching the early fog roll in off the bay. The Langley case had earned her praise, a promotion offer, and more than a few media requests she refused. But there was something about the case that never sat right with her. She had closed dozens of investigations, gang murders, domestic abuse, financial crimes turned fatal. But this one, too clean, too fast, too theatrical. Rachel Monroe pulling the trigger was unquestionable. But Marcus Langley's death? That was different. The toxicology report came back with a digitoxin level 3 times the prescribed dose. That alone was enough to raise eyebrows. But what troubled Alvarez most was that Rachel never had access to Marcus's medication. No fingerprints, no camera footage of tampering, no motive for Rachel to kill him before the funeral. Her rage was raw, yes, but calculated poisoning? That wasn't her style. She dug again through the coroner's notes. One phrase stood out. No sign of defensive injury or ingestion error. Signs consistent with intentional overdosage. Alvarez leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling tiles. There were 2 other names on her notepad, Teresa Langley. Julian Langley. She had dismissed Teresa early on. She was the grieving widow, the target, not the threat. But now, reading through the statements again, she noticed what Teresa didn't say, how she never asked for Marcus's medical report, never inquired about the pills, never pushed for autopsy results. It was as if she knew and didn't care, or worse, had already accepted the outcome before it happened. A new line formed in Alvarez's notebook. What if the first murder was never Marcus? To the public, it was a solved case. But Alvarez knew better. She still hadn't closed a folder marked Marcus Langley. Open questions. Too many loose threads. The elevated digitoxin in his system, the multiple women still surfacing, the anonymous tip hinting that someone in Marcus's own company may have had motive to silence him. But for now, the justice system had moved on. Still, sometimes when she passed the Langley estate during her morning run, she'd slow down. She'd look up at those cold, shuttered windows and wonder, did Teresa know everything? Did she know about the poisoning? Did she know Marcus had written those same promises to 5 different women? Maybe. Or maybe she just knew enough and chose silence as her final act of control. Julian sold the family mansion and moved to Mendocino. A small cabin, a quiet life. the son of two people who were never what they seemed. At night, he read his mother's journals. They were leather-bound, elegant, and painfully honest. Julian had opened them expecting grief, perhaps guilt. But instead, he found a woman recording the quiet unraveling of a marriage built on illusions. Her words were never hysterical. They were surgical, measured, icy. One entry, dated just 2 months before Marcus's death, stopped him cold. He thinks I don't know. About her. About the others. But I count the lies the way he counts his bank accounts. What he doesn't realize is that love, like poison, works slow. First you lose trust, then hope, then the will to forgive. Julian reread the paragraph 5 times. Another entry followed a week later. If the world finds me gone first, they will call me the victim. But if I bury him, they'll say I was the fool who stayed too long. I'm neither. I'm the one who watched the chessboard and made the final move before anyone saw it coming. Julian felt the words press against his chest like a confession carved in marble. He had once idolized his father. Then he had hated him. Now, he wasn't sure whether to grieve the man or fear what he had unleashed. His mother, so elegant, so controlled, had known everything. And maybe, just maybe, she hadn't waited for karma. Maybe she was karma. He folded the journal shut, placed it back in its case, and turned off the light. The silence in the cabin was thick. In them, she never once mentioned Marcus's affairs. Not directly, but her words were tinged with exhaustion, with phrases like performance, mask, and legacy above all. She had known, and she had chosen to stay. Julian used some of his inheritance to fund the Teresa Langley Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping women in emotionally coercive relationships. He never used his father's name again. Once, a reporter caught up to him and asked, "Do you blame Rachel for your mother's death?" He paused, then answered quietly, "No. I blame my father for breaking 2 women so badly that one of them had to bleed to be heard." True crime channels continued to dissect the case. Documentaries were pitched. Podcasts launched seasons titled The Funeral Bullet and The Women Marcus Left Behind. But the public's attention faded, as it always does. New scandals emerged. New tragedies. Rachel's face slowly disappeared from the news cycle. And yet, some stories don't go away. At St. Andrew's Church, a small plaque was placed near the pulpit, in memory of Teresa Langley. She bore in silence what others shouted in rage. Below it, in smaller print, "Let truth be heard before it must be screamed." In her cell, Rachel sat on her bunk and unfolded Marcus's letter one last time. "I promise you, we'll be together soon." She smiled bitterly and whispered, "You were right about one thing." Then she tore it in half. Let the ghost finally die. Outside, the prison yard flooded with late spring sun. Somewhere far away, a woman was stepping out of toxic relationship because of a podcast episode. A foundation brochure. A name she'd never heard before, Teresa Langley. Across the country, debates still lingered. Forums speculated endlessly. Did Teresa kill Marcus? Did Rachel know about the poisoning? Had the funeral shooting been her plan all along? Or the final snap of a broken woman pushed too far? No one could answer for certain. But one truth remained. 3 lies had intersected in a spiral of power, possession, and quiet vengeance. Marcus Langley had played them both, each in different ways. He saw love as currency, women as investments. But in the end, the empire he built on control collapsed at his own funeral. And the women? One lay 6 feet under. One watched the seasons change through steel bars. And one, though gone, had orchestrated more than anyone ever imagined. With gloves, with ink, with patience sharpened over decades. Teresa Langley had never raised her voice. She had never screamed. But now her name lived on. Not as a wife, not as a victim, but as a force. A woman who chose silence over scandal, precision over passion, and whose legacy was now being whispered through every hotline, every survivor group, every woman who finally decided enough was enough. Because sometimes justice doesn't come in handcuffs. Sometimes it comes in a mirror, a journal, a whisper. In that ripple, small, quiet, powerful, the cycle broke. And the truth, at last, had a place to live.